Hello, and welcome to another episode of Accessibility. It's a show on YouTube where I talk about the video game industry, accessibility, and representation. Basically, how can we help more people to play games, and more people to see themselves in the games they play? When playing video games, depending on the genre of game you're playing, you might require more or less mechanical complexity to play. If you're playing something like the recently released Say No More, you basically only need a single button to play and maybe the occasional stick input, whereas on the other end something like an MMO or a Monster Hunter game might require multiple inputs at once in quick rapid succession. For some disabled players, strings of complex button inputs rapidly strung together can be an accessibility barrier, and for those players, one option available to make games more accessible is macros. Basically, a macro is where you tell a computer or a video game or a program, when I press this one button, I want you to execute multiple button presses. Maybe you're setting them in a specific order or at specific timings, but you're basically mapping one input to a different output. You can see how this would be helpful for people with accessibility needs, because if you can't rapidly switch between pressing 4 different buttons in quick succession, being able to press a single button and have those 4 pressed in order can be really helpful. Recently, a story unfolded online that I want to talk about, in which it was claimed that a disabled player had been banned from playing a game called Path of Exile for using macros. The story turned out to be fabricated, but I think it's important that we talk about the story and talk about how it was able to spread, and we talk about the importance of macros and what developers can be doing to make their use more acceptable within communities, because macros are a really important accessibility tool, and this seems like a great opportunity to talk about them. So today, on Accessibility, we're going to talk about macros as an accessibility feature. We're going to talk in depth about the Path of Exile story that recently unfolded, we're going to talk about the uses of macros for disabled players, and we're going to talk about the fact that it's not enough for developers to tacitly allow disabled players to use macros, but we need them to step forward and make active statements to support their use for disabled gamers and accessibility. Let's start by digging into the Path of Exile's accessibility story that recently broke and was debunked. In a post on Reddit's legal advice subreddit, a user claiming to be a disabled player stated that they had been banned from playing Path of Exile, a free-to-play action RPG with MMO-style cooldown abilities, for using macros to automate certain button press combinations while playing. The user claimed that following an industrial accident, they lost the use of one hand completely, and the use of some fingers on the other, and as a result have difficulty playing video games. They claimed that as the game requires certain builds to frequently cycle between potions on number pad keys in quick succession, which they cannot manage, they set those buttons to a macro. Now, so far everything here holds water. This is a very believable situation in which a player might need to make use of a macro for accessibility. Frequent pressing of multiple keys in rapid succession can be an issue if you struggle with manual dexterity, for example. This is a big part of what made this story believable. This is very much the kind of situation where macros can be really helpful for disabled players. The issue at play is that many online multiplayer video games ban the use of macros, at least on paper, due to their potential to give non-disabled players a competitive advantage. If a player who is not disabled maps multiple button inputs to a macro, they may be able to play the game faster than their opponent. That said, generally, it is understood that disabled players should be exempt from these rules. You might not be allowed to use macros in a tournament setting for a game without prior permission, but the idea of banning a disabled player for using macros is very much frowned upon in most communities, even if, and this is important, the rules don't actively say that. The thread on the legal advice subreddit quickly rose in visibility and ultimately garnered a lot of attention in the wider accessibility community, with many contacting the game's developer, Grinding Gear Games, for a comment on the situation, and to try and remedy the ban applied to this player. However, the story had yet to fully unfold. Grinding Gear, for their part, looked into the allegation but were confused, as their policies shouldn't have led to a ban for this user using macros, and when looking through their records of bans applied to users, they could not find a ban matching the description given in the original story. This is because, seemingly, it did not exist. In a second post to the legal advice subreddit, which was later deleted, the original user claimed to be an educator who was teaching a class about how easy it is to manipulate public opinion and discourse through social media. It's unclear if this is true or yet another lie, but it seems clear that someone invented a fake story about being banned from a game for making use of macros for accessibility, and in the process harmed the credibility of future disabled users attempting to get their needs heard by developers. Putting aside the questions of why this Reddit user lied about being banned, the situation does act as a valuable springboard for a wider discussion about the importance of macros, and a conversation that we need to have with game developers about how macros are handled in terms of game moderation. From my research, a lot of games that have rules against the use of macros in online competitive play essentially treat disabled players and their accessibility needs as a bit of an unstated grey area, not formally addressed in terms of service or game rules. I've seen reports of games where users have been banned for using macros, and later had account access restored by contacting developers to explain their situation, but rarely, if ever, do I see disabled player macro use officially on paper acknowledged by developers. Obviously, there are difficulties to be addressed, such as how you rule who gets to use macros and who doesn't without grilling disabled players to prove their identities, but I would love to see more developers make the effort to address this topic more directly. Have a public statement on whether or not you support disabled players using macros. Address whether you have tech in place to detect macro usage. If a player gets banned for using macros as an accessibility tool, have a clear path that they can follow that is laid out online and they can easily find to have their ban reversed. State up front if disabled players are allowed to use their macros in competitive settings, and if so, what limitations, if any, you have on the speed of inputs programmed into those macros. Perhaps even provide that functionality yourself. Acknowledge that macros are an accessibility feature and let everyone use them, opening up the playing field for anyone who wants to use them. Have a stance on macros that acknowledges their value to disabled players and how you view their overall use in the community. Don't leave them as this undiscussed aspect of your game where disabled users have to use them and just quietly hope that's okay. Macros can be invaluable to disabled players, and we shouldn't use the fear that they might be abused by higher-end players to stop us from acknowledging their existence and having public policies on the right for disabled players to use them. While it doesn't seem like Path of Exile's actually banned a disabled player for using macros, the lack of any official statement that says it's okay to use macros in this game if you're disabled, that's a bit of a problem. That could have been fixed, and this could have been much less of a story if there'd been an official statement to that effect. I don't think it's enough for game developers to quietly allow disabled players to use macros. I think that every game developer today could make a statement that says where they stand on this topic. They could make it something easily found, because disabled players deserve to be able to play games knowing up front that they're allowed to use macros, that they're not going to get punished for it, that if they somehow get banned for it, there is a procedure that they can easily look up of how to get that reversed. I want disabled players to go in confident knowing that it's okay for them to use macros, because macros have uses as accessibility features and we need to acknowledge that, and not just sort of quietly pretend it's not a thing and deal with it if it comes up. Be proactive, game developers, please. It doesn't matter if you already quietly allow disabled players to use macros when playing. Make that explicit. If you've got an accessibility menu in your game, why not put this information in there so that players looking for accessibility features know that they're allowed to use macros? Answer questions like, if I want to play ranked or if I want to play in tournaments, can I use the macros that I need to play on a competitive level with other players? Make sure that you are upfront and let people know whether they can use this accessibility feature so that that little worry isn't in the back of their head, because even though this Path of Exile story turned out to be a fabrication, it hit on something very real. A lot of disabled gamers and a lot of people in the accessibility space were very ready to believe this was a real story because so few games have public statements that say it is okay to use macros if you're disabled, and we need to get rid of that weird grey area of uncertainty for disabled players. Macros are an important accessibility feature, and it's time that game developers stood up and acknowledged that, rather than pretending that they didn't exist or that they exist in some grey area that they can just not address and not acknowledge.